Hi, my name is Steve James, and welcome to the More Abundant Life Podcast, episode number 383. After the wonderful and exciting weekend we had with many great teachings, we closed with Bruce Mahone doing the wrap-up of the weekend and his teaching on persistence. Well, I just want to introduce our final teacher for this weekend, a man that I've known for many years, and every time I've heard him teach, I've always been blessed out of my socks because he is that great a teacher, and he does it simply, honestly, and with integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Mahone.
Yeah, that's why I wear flip-flops, so I can't get blessed out of my socks. All right. Well, delighted to be here, and I see Mary Rose Dundon is on the phone. She, along with her husband, Brian, host our fellowship events and our website and all kinds of great stuff in Virginia. So welcome. Glad you guys can be with us. Well, this has been one of the most amazing Kleenex fellowships. Being here in Bowdoin, Maine at the Janes with them taking such good care of us, and just very, very thankful to be here. So just for a little recap for the weekend, Steve taught our first fellowship, our first teaching here, and he talked about those, obviously the theme verse we kept coming back to, those believers were more noble than those in Thessalonica, those ones at Berea, because they searched the scriptures daily. Been a big emphasis this weekend. And then he talked about studying to show yourself approved unto God by rightly dividing the word of truth, and how the word works in those who believe. And it's not enough to know the word, you have to actually believe it. And so that was an awfully wonderful teaching, followed by Bob Swan, where we're to exercise ourselves unto godliness. Let's hit the spiritual gym. And it's high time to awake out of darkness. May the Host be with you. When he talked about the 4 steps down by departing from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits, speaking lies, conscience seared, and you avoid it by continuing in the word. And one man awake with dawn in his eyes, one man up with dawn in his eyes, multiplies. That was great. Such a great thing. And we have to put in the work. We have to labor fervently in prayer, praying always, and God has no hands on our hands. Then we went on to hear John Valding talk about patient endurance. And by the way, so many of these teachings were a great setup, a great preparation for what I'm going to share with you all. So I appreciate that very much. But only 3 or 4 of the verses I was going to teach were covered, but the concepts were very, very well done. So John talked about Hezekiah trusted in the Lord. The Lord was with Joseph and he prospered. In that great section from Lamentations, great is thy faithfulness. We quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. And then, of course, Jesus Christ for the joy that was set before him. And, you know, Ken talked some about this and we had a chat about it. It doesn't actually say Jesus Christ had joy when he was crucified, but the joy that was set before him. He saw what was coming, sort of like some of you driving up 95 to get here. You may not have enjoyed the drive, but you were looking forward to the great fellowship you were going to have when you got here. So, yeah, so I feel with you on that. So, yeah, I went through more traffic detours and intense thunderstorms than I usually do for me coming. But I was looking forward to getting here. So, although I didn't enjoy every minute of the drive, I enjoyed getting here. So that was great. And then, of course, Deb Quillett talking about relentless devotion, about the importance of loving one another, and a great example she gave about confiding in the Lord. Just pour out your heart before the Lord. There's so many verses about that in the scriptures. If you seek the Lord, you'll find him.
Yes.
And places in the Psalms, you know, where I cried unto the Lord and he leaned over and listened to me. So you just confiding in the Lord is great. And of course, 2 Timothy, we have power, love, and a sound mind. And then Sheila taught about God's treasure-filled path of his word. We learned about acres of diamonds right in your own backyard. No reason to go. I had a friend in college. We used to talk about And on Saturday nights, he liked to talk about going wild. We'd all go out and dancing and have a great time. And he said, we have acres of going wild right in our own backyard. And we have acres of whatever it is you may need right in your own backyard because God's there to provide. So what a great thing that was. And of course, faith cometh by hearing the word of the Lord, and the sword of the Spirit's the word of God. And I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Let's get back to Sheila here. Acres of diamonds, you put the past behind you and move ahead. I rejoice that thy word is one that findeth great spoil. So there's the acres of diamonds, the great treasure, finding the word. And in Jeremiah, thy word was found, and it was the joy and rejoicing of mine heart. In First Peter, God's word is much, and our salvation is much more precious than gold and silver. And then, of course, the great example of being on lead, where she found out that God's word is a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path, and God showed her the light. And then John Bennett said we should search the word to find out whether those things were so. It is written, everything that comes out of the mouth of God, every word comes from the mouth of God. Faith cometh by hearing the word of God, and the word of God is the sword of the Spirit. And then he talked about some of the persecutions, and Romans and Thessalonians and tribulations are not the great tribulation. That comes later in the book of Revelation. And then he shared about a bunch of things he was working in Revelation and about the hope that he's still working on. Many of them he admitted he didn't have the final answer, but he was working it, and he just sort of shared some of his thought processes. And perhaps he'll come back next year and have solved those problems. I don't know. But I admire the fact that he was working the word so hard and trying to figure them out. And then he ended with 1 Corinthians 15 about the gathering together, and talked about what exciting times those will be. And they will be. That'll be great. I had an Uber rider the other day that was on his last legs with stage 4 cancer. I mentioned to him that about the gathering together. He was very honest, because he said he knew he was only going to live about a year, and he was scared. But then I shared with him about the gathering together, told him about our fellowship website, and probably never hear from him, but at least I was able to share that with him and comfort him and give him a place to go if he wants more. This was somebody an Uber rider. Yeah. I was the driver. He was the rider. Yes. And then it could have been the other way around, but I was driving. He was riding. And then, of course, Steve taught last night about faith cometh by hearing the word of God. And then he shared some great stuff about the influence of French. Before 1066, English was a Germanic language from all the Germanic Angles and Saxons that had come. But then the French controlled the English court for a couple hundred years. And now English is about half French words and about half Anglo-Saxon words. And faith, of course, he pointed out, was from Old French, whereas the word believe was from Old English. Very good insight. And he talked about, we have to know about the manifestation of spirits, holy and unholy. Can't be ignorant of his devices. The thief cometh not but for to steal and kill and destroy. The serpent, it's important to tell people where evil comes from. I'm studying a lot of church history in the Middle Ages in preparation for a book on grace I'm working on, trying to get a better scope from where all the modern Christian doctrines come from. And one of their big fights was, if God is perfect, why is there evil in the world? And of course, we know it's because people, and apparently spirits, have freedom of will. And many of people and many of the spirits chose to disobey God, starting with Eve. And then he talked about how we never look for the fault, we look for the deliverance. And that's a great thing, because a statement I've made many times is that there's two kinds of Christians. Ones that focus on the sins of man, and the one that focus on the deliverance of sin through Jesus Christ, which is obviously what we would prefer to do. And then we need to choose the good fight. We need to choose the good fight. That's what we need to focus on. Steve ended his teaching with reminding us to be transformed by the renewing of our minds and continue to search the scriptures. And then this morning, Barb Bennett had a wonderful teaching on having favor. She talked about we had favor and grace, our grace and peace was multiplied. Then she made a big point about getting rid of sin consciousness. You know, there was a time when I was like 17, or maybe it was 20, but Dr. Werwell taught a special advanced class at headquarters for a week. And he taught some more stuff than in his regular advanced class. Then the last night came. And I was so excited. Boy, he's going to tell us a new key to walking in the spirit, or I expect something really deep. You know what he taught on? Sin consciousness. Yeah. He said sin consciousness is what keeps Christians walking and living as servants of God instead of sons of God. So we shouldn't be thinking about our sin. We should be thinking about the deliverance of sin through Jesus Christ. So, at any rate, Barb did say, get rid of sin consciousness, live this life more abundantly, having favor with God. Great grace was upon them all in Acts 4. When Barnabas showed up to the fellowship in Acts 11, he saw the grace of God. It was so obvious. And Romans 3, being justified freely by his grace, and then all those great verses in Ephesians about grace. And then Romans 5, of course, we have access through faith into this grace wherein we stand. In God's presence, there is power. So that was a wonderful teaching. And she actually took me to page 2. And we can find grace to help in time of need. We need that. Sometimes we get in a mess and we figure, well, I'll get out of the mess, then I'll pray. No. And he's able to keep you from failing. And then, of course, Ken had a great teaching this morning. We minister grace to one another, and talking about the son of that poor, or the father of that poor possessed boy. And Jesus Christ turned it around and said, if you can believe, all things are possible. And then he talked a lot about the integrity and accuracy of God's word, and then what difference does it make is not a good question to ask. Because it's very important that we work the word and see that it fit. Oh, by the way, the next chapter of, or the next phase of my work on grace, a month from now, we're going to have a weekend in the Word with our fellowship in Virginia. And I'm calling the class that weekend, The Challenge of Biblical Research. And I'm going to focus on to whom things are written. Because for all the verses there are that talk about us being saved by grace, there are almost as many that give you a whole list of bad behavior and say, if you do that, basically, you're not going to get saved. And the key is they cannot be written to us, right? Because we already are saved. So I'm going to start out saying there's 4 ways to look at the Bible. A lot of people just look at it and they think it is confusing or contradictory, so they don't read it. And then there are those who just pick out the verses they like and ignore them. And then there are those, which applies a lot to us, we're in a group where the leaders of the group chose the ones to believe and ignored the ones they didn't like. But then biblical research is where you let the word interpret itself. And I'm just going to take this, at least in my mind, a step further than I ever had. Because I, including everybody in ministry, has always taught the verses about how we're saved by grace and we didn't earn our righteousness. And they're all very clear. But then there's all these other lists of things, you're going to hell if you do any of this. Well, we're not going to hell. Well, first of all, there's actually no hell in the Bible, but there's a lake of fire. But it can't apply to us. So that's what I'm going to be. That's my next thing, because before I'm going to write a book about grace, anytime I teach or write anything, I always handle every difficult verse I can figure out. I teach the clear ones. If you look at any of my classes on our website, you'll find I teach the clear ones, but then there's a bunch of difficult ones that would seem to contradict what I just taught. And I go in and I address them. And I try to explain to the best of my ability why they don't apply and why the clear ones are the correct ones. And by the way, if you wanted to simplify biblical research down to one little statement, the difficult verse must be understood in light of the clear and simple verses. There's a lot of other detail that Bullinger has in his books that Dr. Worrell taught us in the foundational class. It's great stuff, but you can simplify it all down to, you have to look at the difficult verse in light of the clear one. That's what Steve does. That's why he rarely appears flaky. Is that a fair statement?
Yes,
Okay.
I'll take it.
Just want to be honest here. Okay, well, that's a good summary of the weekend so far. Now I think I'll do my teaching.
All right.
So let's see if I have my notes here. And I promise not to get between you and your lobster and clams and corn on the cob or whatever they're bringing. Is that what it is? Lobster and clams and corn on the cob? And potatoes. Okay. Clarified butter.
Clarified butter.
If you ever melted butter, you notice there's a little bit of foam on the top. Scrape that off. And what's left in the clear part, that's the clarified part.
You see, you come to a fellowship here, you learn everything.
Everything you need. Oh, Mary Rose, welcome back. Which is why I'm teaching on persistence. We have persisted in many things, and there are been a lot of statements through the years. One of the, motivational writers we read about, listened to decades ago, had a phrase, "I will persist until I succeed." Can't remember who it was, but it's a good one. And one of the great, everybody's heard a lot about Winston Churchill. One of the things he's known for is that after the second time he left 10 Downing Street when he was the Prime Minister of England, he came to the US to give the commencement or graduation speech at a Midwestern university. And the story I've heard is he gets up on the stage, looks at the crowd and says, "Never, never, never give up." And then he sat down. So that's just one example. And he was a very persistent fellow. A lot of people, his predecessor as Prime Minister in England, just around the time World War II was starting, wanted to negotiate some kind of peace with the Germans and give up all kind of territory, but he wouldn't have it. He was the bulldog. So you can say a lot of things about his politics or his activities, but one thing is he never gave up. So we're going to read about persistence. Now, first thing I was going to cover was Joseph, but John Valding talked about this, so I won't go into much detail of it. But Joseph obviously was sold into slavery by his own brothers. And a lot of people in that kind of situation would just give up, despair. But he didn't. He continued to look to God and he prospered. And then, of course, then his master's wife framed him and he was thrown into prison. And again, a lot of people would just give up, but he didn't. He continued to look to God and persist in praying. And again, it doesn't tell us the details, but he must have done something to walk with God for God to bless him and him to prosper and him to get all that revelation. So he was doing something to walk with God. I don't know if he was, let me see, were there even any scriptures back then? Yeah, it was after Moses. They could have had the law of Moses. But whatever he did, he just kept looking to God. And then John gave some other examples. Paul was stoned day and the night in the deep. Yet did he persist?
Yeah.
Sure did. Sure did. I mean, all of you came up 95 and you persisted. And Jesus Christ, like we talked again, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross and despised the shame. He didn't like it when it happened. I mean, the night before he was sweating great drops of blood. And he did ask God if there was a way out of it, but God said nope. And so he went through with it. And then after the resurrection and the ascension, then he got the joy. And he's still seated at the right hand of God. Now, I'd like to read Ruth chapter 1 and verse 8. We're familiar with Ruth. She and her sister-in-law and her mother-in-law were in Moab when all the men in the family died. It's always tough when the man in the family dies, but in that particular culture, it was very difficult for a woman to get along by herself. Or her mother-in-law, Naomi, said to the two girls, "Go back to your families." And Orpah did, but Ruth decided to stay with Naomi. And she says, "I will be with you. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." And they went back. And of course, Naomi sent her out in the fields to glean, which was an accepted. Pickers go through and take all the grain they can, but they miss some of it. And you're supposed to leave it there for widows and orphans and visitors. So she did that. And of course, found out that the guy that owned the field was a guy named Boaz, who was a close relative of theirs. So had the right to redeem her from her widowhood by marrying her. Again, Naomi told her to go up to the threshing floor and ask him to cover her with his garment, which is a sign of protection. And he did. And then the next day in Ruth chapter 3, now I got to find Ruth. You guys have found it already.
Yeah.
Let me see. Job sounds I always forget where Ruth is. Joshua judges Ruth. He shouldn't. He never even met her. Why would he judge her? Joshua judges Ruth, and in verse 3, chapter 3, Ruth 3:18. So after Ruth went home to talk to Naomi, then said she, "Sit still, my daughter, until thou know how the matter will fall, for the man will not be in rest until he have finished with the thing this day." She had to persist. She had to be patient. She had to wait. But she did. And wouldn't you know it, Boaz decided to marry her, and she had a son, and she ended up being like the great-grandfather. She ended up being like something like the great-great-grandmother of King David. So she ended up in the Christ line. That's quite a switch from being a destitute widow in a foreign land to having a son who's in the Christ line. Quite amazing. Okay, let's go to 2 Kings 4 with Elijah. You see, you just have to persist. 2 Kings 4, verse 32. This is Elisha with the Shunammite woman. Remember, the Shunammite woman took care of him, and he told her she was going to have a son, and she laughed and said, "That's not possible." But sure enough, she had a son. But then when he got a little older, he died. And then Elijah went in there, the room with him alone. And this is a good example of you don't always get the revelation immediately. And you can't perform a miracle without revelation. You can't walk up to somebody you want and just say, "Be healed," unless God tells you to.
Yeah.
Now, if God tells you to, yes, we have the power to do it. I mean, look at that guy at the Temple Gate Beautiful. Jesus Christ probably walked by him. The other apostles probably walked by him, but it wasn't until after the day of Pentecost when Peter and John were there, they got the revelation, and before you know it, he was walking and leaping and praising God. So here we go with, so I talk to a lot of people, and when they're sick and they want healing, I just ask God. I mean, you can always pray for people, but unless God gives me the go ahead to minister to them, I just don't, and I don't get worried about it, and I don't put any pressure on myself, and I don't feel bad about it. I just try to love them and pray for them, but I'm not going to run in laying hands on them and saying, "Get up in the name of Jesus," unless I get the revelation, and then I will do it. So, and there's another great thing about ministering to God's people. Don't let yourself get down for the people because of the people you can't help. It could be you don't get the revelation. It could be they don't want your help. It could be you feel bad because you didn't say the right thing, all kinds of stuff. But if you get all wrapped up in that I can't help Betty Boop over here, what happens when Johnny Jump Up comes by and wants help? Your mind's too fried from being worried about Betty Boop to help her. But if you do whatever you can for Betty Boop, then let it go and move on. Then when Johnny Jump Up walks in, you'll have your mental faculties to be able to help Johnny Jump Up. So I think we should do everything we can to help everybody. But when you've done what you can, let it go. That's a good thing about Uber. People get in the car, I talk to them, and 10 minutes later, they're gone. And if they showed any interest in the word, I've told them about our website, and they know where to go, and they can come back for more. And some will, some won't, but that's their choice.
Yeah.
Any rate, that's just me. I'm sure you have ways you talk to people. That's just what works for my life. Okay, 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 32. And when Elisha was come into the house, behold, the child was dead and laid upon his bed. He went in therefore and shut the door upon them twain and prayed unto the Lord. And he went and lay upon the child and put his mouth upon his mouth, his eyes upon his. It has to be by revelation.
Yeah.
There's no way with common sense you would do it. But he lay on the boy, and his eyes upon his eyes, his hands upon his hands, and he stretched them upon the child, and the flesh of the child waxed warm. Reminds me of that time Jesus Christ was ministering to a blind man, and he said he saw men as trees walking. First time he didn't get it all the way, got about halfway there. Then he had to go minister a second time, and then the guy could see normally. Well, Elijah again, it doesn't say it, but there's no other good explanation I know of than that he got revelation and he did lie upon the child and his flesh waxed warm. Verse 35, then he returned and walked in the house to and fro. And again, it doesn't tell us, but just knowing common sense, how the renewed mind, the manifestations and revelation works, he was probably just walking back and forth, praying, waiting for more revelation. And why God didn't tell him the whole thing right away, maybe he had to get to the place where his believing and focus were there. I don't know. But no matter what it was, he had to persist. He didn't give up. He had to persist. Verse 35, then he returned, walked in the house to and fro, and went up and stretched himself upon him, and the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Verse 36, and he called Gehazi, his servant, and said, call this Shunammite. So he called her, and when she was come in unto him, he said, take up thy son. Then she went in and fell at his feet and bowed herself to the ground and took up her son and went out. So he had to persist. So he clearly knew that he'd gotten a little revelation. There might be more coming. So he stuck with it. And there was. Now, there's that great record in Chronicles I love so much about. This is where I think the term jumping Jehoshaphat came from. Because Jehoshaphat, who was a king of Judah and a great believer, was invaded by 3 different countries. So he was outnumbered 3-1. And instead of panicking, well, it actually does say he got scared. So there was a little momentary panic, but he seemed to have overcome it because he basically called everybody together for a big believers meeting. And he got them there, and then he prayed. In 2 Chronicles 20, verse 12, he must have had great believing, and God was very, very gracious in this situation. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 12, as he's praying in this big believers meeting in the middle of Jerusalem with half the kingdom there probably, he says, O our God, wilt thou not judge them? For we have no might against this great company that cometh against us. We do not have enough military power to fight them off. We don't. We're outnumbered 3-1. We have no might against this great company that cometh against us. Neither know we what to do, but our eyes are upon thee. What a great prayer. I often like to talk to people about not limiting God. You have the promise of God, but unless God tells you what's going to happen or what to do, don't try to tell God exactly how to do it. Just say, God, I have this problem. I need deliverance, and see what doors he opens. Well, what happens here is remarkable because the Spirit of God comes on a fellow in the group. Remember, they weren't all born again like today. There was maybe 1 or 2 people in Jerusalem that had Spirit of God. I don't know, but the Spirit of God specifically came on a fellow, and he stood up and basically said, God, listen to you. You're not going to need to fight in this battle. Just go out to the battlefield tomorrow singing hymns, and you'll be fine. So the next morning they get up and they're marching out singing, glory to his name. I have left the land of bondage. I don't know what they were singing, but they were singing some great music. And when they got to the battlefield, the 3 enemy armies had killed each other. And all they did, they spent 3 days carrying all the loot back to town. So the day before looked like certain defeat, total obliteration. The day after, they're hauling loot back for 3 days. Can you imagine how much gold and silver and jewels and whatever it took them 3 days to haul it back? Because they persisted. They prayed. They didn't give up on God, but they also didn't try to tell God what to do. They just said, Lord, we don't know. Help us out. And the Lord came through.
In the next episode, we'll finish Bruce's teaching on persistence. In the meantime, you can look over the show notes below. I have the latest announcements at the beginning of the show notes. You can see the upcoming events, and there are links to all the podcasts, all my website teachings, and how to link in to the Zoom fellowships.